before we get started, I want to go over some of the tools that I use to do some of my LED mods. So my best friend is going to be this multimeter. I basically use it in two modes, one for connectivity testing, so you can look for the ohms of resistance, touch the two ends together, and anything that's connected, you should see that the resistance should drop. Sometimes if you test things the wrong way, either there will be infinite resistance. When it says OL, it means open line. Or you might see, for example, if you try to test current through or connectivity through a chip, for example, you'll actually see a great deal of resistance. But basically, if I wanted to test to see if I soldered something correctly, like one end of a wire to another, then I would just basically put both of these on either end just to check to see if they're connected. So that's my first tool. I also sometimes will actually use it to measure the amount of voltage traveling through something, and that's useful for testing batteries, but I use that less frequently. So you're going to be doing a lot of cutting of wires and soldering, and you will need a good pair of flush cutters. These flush cutters are a little bit worn out. That's because I actually abuse these guys. You can get them for about $10–15 on Amazon. I wouldn't recommend going for like the $30 ones that you get from Hako, basically because this thing will just get dinged up, especially if you start using it on plastic like I do all the time. I know I shouldn't, but sometimes it's the most convenient tool for cutting plastic. You'll also need wire strippers, so it doesn't have to be fancy, a decent pair, and yep. So to manipulate things, I frequently use these angled pliers. I don't remember where I picked these guys up, but they're my best friends, simply because you're going to need to be able to bend things, twist things. It's a little easier to use than a straight needle nose plier. Bent nose pliers allow you to get in, move things around, and I just happen to like using them for creating right angles if I need to, if I bend, for example, the tip of an LED. For larger projects where I get to use any sort of crimped ends, either with JST connectors or whatever, I'll use wire crimpers. These are actually pretty tricky to use, these large ones. I've seen some videos where people use not the ones that compress both ends of a jumper together, or sorry, a header or a plug or whatever you call those things. They use smaller ones where you have to compress each side at a time. It's probably easier to use than this guy. I actually have wasted a ton of JST connections just trying to learn how to get these things to work, and it's pretty unforgiving if you mess up. So this is going to take some practice if you want to use it, and pretty much the only good place to use it are on extremely large or spacious ships where the connectors will fit, because the connectors do take up a lot of room inside of the ship itself. For this video, I'm working on a Shadowcaster, which has almost zero room inside of it, so these things are not going to get used. In addition, for some plastic cutting and drilling, I have these 0.7 millimeter drill bits that you can use on a hand drill. I don't recommend using them with a power drill, which is why I'm missing a whole bunch of drill bits now. And these are good for actually boring the holes that will thread LEDs or fiber optics through. So when you're actually doing your work trying to open up the ships, I recommend using small screwdrivers. I've seen videos using razor blades, and I suppose if you're less accident prone than me, that would be a good idea. But I just, with the amount of force that you're going to end up using on the ships themselves trying to find an opening and opening those things up, I don't recommend using a razor blade. You'll break a whole bunch of them, you'll probably cut yourself. So a screwdriver set is good enough for just trying to open up some of the gaps, and then really to pry the ships apart. Once I can fit this thing inside and get it near some of the studs and posts, I can jam this thing in and twist it, and you'll see that a little later, and that'll actually pop some of those plastic posts open. So for some power tools now. I do a lot of my joins using a basically shrink tube. Essentially, it's just rubber tubing that when you apply heat to it shrinks, and so this is the heat gun. You can get a set of shrink tubing as well as the gun itself for, I don't know, 40 bucks on Amazon. As far as the things that have made sure that my LED connection stays solid, this is probably going to be the best one. It allows you to do all sorts of stuff, like for example, if you don't want to solder the LEDs and you just want to stick them inside of like jumper wires, you can use shrink tubing, and that'll help hold the LEDs into place. In addition, it's pretty much an absolute requirement for doing fiber optics, since you have to shrink tube fiber optics to each other and then onto the LEDs themselves. Finally, my trusty Dremel. So I do have a Dremel. It'd probably be easier to use if you got one of those extensions that allows you to stick a little hose on here and then the end of it turns so that you have like a smaller instrument to work with. But this works just fine. That's not to say that I haven't made some mistakes before. The particular sets that I use, I don't use just the spinning blade, the disc cutters. I also use an engraving set to go through plastic. You got to be really careful with it because the Dremel heats up the plastic very quickly, and instead of either abrading or cutting, pretty soon you're going to be melting into the plastic, and that will cause all sorts of problems that you don't want to deal with, and you'll have to patch up with, like, green stuff later on. Soldering, that's the last thing. So I have just plain old rosin core solder. As for my soldering iron, it's nothing fancy. It's just one of these simple Chinese ones that this one actually may be Japanese. This will go up to 200 degrees Celsius, and you want to keep the heat rather low, simply because you're going to have a hard time soldering, especially once electronics go into the chips themselves, if you need to correct anything. You're also going to want to keep a set that has a small tip, or at least a tip that you can change out for a smaller tip. I've seen some people try to work on electronics with like those huge soldering guns that are better for like extremely thick gauged wire. Don't do that. Save yourself the pain and get like a nice small soldering iron. It doesn't have to have a lot of heat to it. You'll want to have some temperature control over it just because you'll find yourself in a situation where you're melting through plastic every once in a while. To keep your soldering iron clean, I actually use a copper braid, and I have a soldering station. I'll bring it into the camera real quick. A soldering station that looks like this. It's got helping hands and a magnifying glass, and it actually has a light that turns on and off, and that's super useful. So those are kind of the sets of tools that I have. I would say that this is probably, with the exception of this thing, that's pretty much the bare minimum that you're going to need to be able to work on ships. That's pretty much what I do it with, and as far as the accessories and materials go, I have a lot of those as well.